Over 620,000 American lives extinguished. More than the combat deaths of World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. This was not an invasion from a foreign empire. This was a nation tearing its own heart out. The United States was deeply divided by blood, iron, and the unforgivable chains of slavery. April 1861. Decades of bitter political tension finally ignite in the harbor of Fort Sumter. 11 southern states declare their secession, raising the flag of the newly formed Confederate States of America. In Washington, a burdened President Abraham Lincoln urgently calls for 75,000 volunteers to crush the rebellion. Young men from northern factories and southern farms rush to enlist, seeking glory and adventure. Both the North and the South firmly believe this conflict will be over in just a few short weeks. July 1861. The two massive armies finally meet at Manassas, near the winding waters of Bull Run. In a display of sheer arrogance, wealthy civilians bring picnic baskets to watch the battle from a nearby hill. They expected a colorful, bloodless pageant. Instead, the Confederate forces unleash a ferocious counterattack. The terrifying sound of the rebel yell echoes across the field as artillery shreds through the Union ranks. The Union Army completely collapses, fleeing in absolute panic alongside the terrified, screaming spectators. The picnic is over. America wakes up to a horrifying reality. The industrial slaughter has only just begun. The illusion of a quick, glorious victory evaporated into the smoke of Bull Run. Both sides braced for a long, grueling conflict. Across the North, massive industrial factories began churning out weapons, uniforms, and ammunition at an unprecedented, terrifying scale. In glowing foundries, exhausted workers poured molten iron day and night, forging heavy artillery that would soon tear through human flesh. But the true harbinger of death was a simple infantry weapon, the rifled musket, capable of lethal accuracy at staggering distances. Firing a heavy, conical lead projectile known as the Minié ball, this weapon shattered bones and caused catastrophic, irreplaceable tissue damage. Yet, aristocratic generals on both sides clung stubbornly to outdated Napoleonic tactics, ordering their men to march in tight, linear formations. Shoulder to shoulder, brave young men marched perfectly in step, directly into a concentrated hail of accurate, modern lead. It was an absolute meat grinder. Field hospitals were completely overwhelmed, with amputation becoming the swift, brutal standard of military medicine. Outside the dark surgical tents, discarded boots and bloody uniforms piled up in the dirt. But invisible diseases killed far more soldiers. By September 1862, the Confederate Army, under General Robert E. Lee, boldly crossed the Potomac River, invading Northern territory. They were intercepted by massive Union forces near the quiet Maryland town of Sharpsburg, right beside the winding Antietam Creek. At dawn on September 17th, the fog lifted to reveal a sprawling battlefield. The horrific Battle of Antietam had officially begun. In a 20-acre cornfield, the firefight became so incredibly dense that every single cornstalk was entirely flattened by flying lead. Soldiers fell in massive, tangled heaps. The once peaceful sunken road was soon filled with still silhouettes as the water turned dark. When the sun finally set, 22,717 men were casualties. The bloodiest single day in American history. The staggering death toll at Antietam shocked the nation, but it gave President Lincoln the political victory he desperately needed. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, fundamentally altering the moral purpose of the bloody war. It was no longer just a struggle to preserve a broken union. It officially became a holy crusade to eradicate this institution of slavery. Tens of thousands of freed African American men eagerly enlisted in the Union Army, donning the blue uniform to fight for their ultimate liberation. These newly formed black regiments fought with unmatched ferocity, knowing that surrender meant returning to chains or facing immediate execution by the Confederacy. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, a relentless and unyielding Union commander was steadily making a name for himself. General Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike the overly cautious generals in the East, Grant clearly understood that this new industrial war required brutal, continuous, and uncompromising pressure. His primary target was Vicksburg, an impregnable Confederate fortress situated high on the steep bluffs, completely controlling the vital Mississippi River. When direct frontal assaults failed miserably, Grant decided to encircle the city, cutting off all food and supplies in a merciless siege. For 47 agonizing days, the trapped soldiers and civilians of Vicksburg endured a living nightmare under constant, deafening Union artillery bombardment. Families were violently forced to abandon their elegant homes and dig dark, claustrophobic caves into the yellow clay hills just to survive the explosive shells. As starvation tightened its suffocating grip, the desperate civilian population was reduced to eating horses, dogs, and eventually the rats that scurried through the trenches. Dysentery and malaria swept rapidly through the Confederate camps, silently killing men who were already critically weakened by severe malnutrition and endless exhaustion. On July 4, 1863, the starving, skeletal defenders of Vicksburg finally surrendered, splitting the entire Confederate territory completely in two. But exactly at that same moment, 1,000 miles to the east, the ultimate climax of the entire war was already unfolding at a small crossroads town. July 1, 1863. General Lee's invading army inadvertently collided with Union cavalry in the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. What started as a minor, chaotic skirmish quickly escalated into the absolute largest battle ever fought on the North American continent. Over 3 sweltering summer days, 160,000 men clashed fiercely across peach orchards, wheat fields, and rocky hillsides. The Union Army stubbornly secured the high ground at Cemetery Ridge, organizing their massive forces into an unbreakable, defensive fishhook formation. Convinced of his army's total invincibility, General Lee made a fateful decision to launch a massive frontal assault directly at the Union center. This doomed maneuver would become known to history as Pickett's Charge. 12,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out from the distant tree line. They had to march across nearly a mile of completely open agricultural ground, completely exposed to the Union artillery positioned high above. Union cannons immediately tore massive, devastating gaps through the advancing gray lines, yet the disciplined Confederates kept marching steadily forward. As they finally reached the stone wall, brutal and desperate hand-to-hand combat erupted in a blinding storm of smoke and flying dirt. The Confederate assault was entirely decimated. Barely half of the brave men who started the charge managed to return to their lines. Riding out to meet the broken, bleeding survivors, a devastated General Lee repeatedly mourned, "It is all my fault. It is all my fault." Heavy rain began to fall on July 4th, washing over the dark, silent battlefield that claimed 51,000 total American casualties. A wagon train loaded with screaming, severely wounded Confederate soldiers stretched for an agonizing 17 miles as they retreated back south. 4 months later, a grieving President Lincoln visited the scarred Pennsylvania landscape to dedicate a national cemetery for the fallen dead. In a remarkably brief, 2-minute speech, he promised the nation that these honored dead shall not have died in vain. Despite the profound words spoken at Gettysburg, the industrial slaughter was far from over. In fact, it was about to become much worse. In the spring of 1864, President Lincoln finally found his ultimate weapon, promoting Ulysses S. Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant's brutal arithmetic was simple. Use the North's overwhelming advantage in manpower to relentlessly grind down the Confederate forces without pause. This new strategy was immediately tested in the wilderness, a terrifyingly dense and tangled forest in Virginia, where visibility was practically zero. Gunfire ignited the dry underbrush, transforming the dark woods into a blazing inferno that tragically consumed trapped and wounded soldiers. Previous commanders would have retreated after taking such horrific casualties. But Grant simply ordered his battered army to keep marching south. Covered in mud and blood, the exhausted Union troops suddenly began to cheer. They knew they were finally going to finish the war, but the cost was unfathomable. The campaign devolved into grueling, muddy trench warfare at places like Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. Knowing they were marching into a meat grinder, brave men began pinning pieces of paper with their names to their coats to identify their corpses. While Grant occupied General Lee in Virginia, another ruthless commander was unleashed upon the Deep South. General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman fundamentally believed that to defeat the Confederacy, he had to completely break the psychological will of the Southern civilian population. He implemented the terrifying concept of total war, laying siege to Atlanta, the vital industrial and railroad heart of the South. By September, Atlanta fell and was deliberately set ablaze, sending massive pillars of dark smoke into the sky and shockwaves through the Confederacy. Sherman then began his infamous march to the sea, cutting a devastating 60-mile-wide path of destruction straight across the state of Georgia. His men destroyed crops, burned plantations, and heated ripped-up railroad tracks to wrap them around trees, crippling the South's infrastructure forever. While Sherman systematically gutted the Deep South, General Grant kept Robert E. Lee pinned down in Virginia, right outside the Confederate capital. For 9 grueling months, the two exhausted armies fought a miserable, static trench war around the vital railroad hub of Petersburg. By early April 1865, the starving and severely depleted Confederate defensive lines finally cracked under the relentless Union artillery pressure. General Lee's broken army was forced to abandon Richmond, desperately setting massive fires to their own military storehouses as they fled into the night. Triumphant Union troops marched into the burning, ruined capital, marking the absolute symbolic death of the Confederate government. Lee desperately tried to move his surviving forces westward, frantically hoping to regroup and continue the bloody fight in the Carolina mountains. But his men were completely shattered. Thousands marched without shoes, collapsing along the muddy dirt roads from extreme hunger and physical exhaustion. Grant's massive cavalry forces ruthlessly cut off every single escape route, completely surrounding the ragged Confederate remnants in a tight iron grip. Recognizing that further bloodshed was absolutely useless, General Lee finally sent a lone horseman forward, carrying a torn white flag of truce. On April 9, 1865, the two legendary military commanders agreed to meet inside a simple brick home at Appomattox courthouse. The visual contrast was incredibly striking. General Lee arrived first, wearing an immaculate, formal dress uniform and carrying a beautiful ceremonial sword. A half-hour later, General Grant arrived in a mud-splattered, completely unbuttoned private's coat, carrying no weapon at all. Despite the immense bitterness of the 4-year war, the surrender terms written by Grant were surprisingly generous and profoundly respectful. Confederate soldiers were simply allowed to turn in their weapons, keep their personal horses, and return to their farms in total peace. As Lee rode back to his defeated men, Union artillery began to fire celebratory salutes, but Grant immediately ordered them to stop. The surrender at Appomattox sent massive waves of joyous celebration rippling across the entire exhausted North. But this bright euphoria would prove to be incredibly short-lived. A dark tragedy was secretly being plotted in the capital. Just 5 days after the surrender, President Lincoln attended a comedic play at Ford's Theater to finally rest his weary mind. At 10:15 p.m., a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth silently slipped into the presidential box. Waiting exactly for a loud line of dialogue to mask the sound, Booth raised a small Derringer pistol and fired a single fatal shot. The president slumped forward instantly. Booth leaped from the balcony onto the stage, shouting, "Thus always to tyrants," before escaping into the night. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had agonizingly steered the nation through its darkest hour, died the very next morning. The North was instantly plunged from victorious celebration into a state of absolute, traumatized mourning. The architect of the peace was gone. Black crape draped over every building in Washington as Lincoln's funeral train began a slow, deeply sorrowful journey back to Illinois. With Lincoln dead, the monumental task of rebuilding the shattered nation fell into uncertain, chaotic hands. The physical damage to the South was catastrophic. Entire cities were reduced to ash, and the regional economy was completely obliterated. But the human toll was even more terrifying to comprehend. 2% of the entire American population had been completely wiped out. Hundreds of thousands of surviving veterans returned home with severe, permanent physical amputations, struggling to farm or work ever again. Furthermore, the psychological trauma, known then as soldier's heart, left countless men haunted by the invisible ghosts of the trenches. America had successfully preserved the Union and abolished slavery, but the incredibly deep scars left on the land would take generations to heal. The war fundamentally transformed the United States from a loose collection of individual states into a single, indivisible nation. Before the bloodshed, citizens would say, "The United States are." After the war, it permanently became, "The United States is." 3 groundbreaking constitutional amendments were born from the ashes, permanently abolishing slavery and promising equal protection under the law. However, the harsh reality of Reconstruction meant that true equality for African Americans would be violently delayed for another century. The South lay in absolute economic ruin, taking decades to rebuild its burned cities and shattered agricultural infrastructure. Meanwhile, the North emerged as an unstoppable global industrial powerhouse, fueled by wartime manufacturing and rapid new railroad expansions. The weapons of mass destruction tested on American soil heavily foreshadowed the horrific mechanized slaughters of the upcoming 20th century. Trenches, Gatling guns, and ironclad ships proved that the romanticized, glorious era of Napoleonic cavalry charges was dead forever. But beyond the politics and technology, the true legacy of the Civil War remains buried in the silent, endless rows of white tombstones. 620,000 men, fathers, sons, and brothers who slaughtered each other over the soul of a divided nation. Entire towns lost a whole generation of young men, leaving behind grieving widows and a collective trauma that haunted the countryside. Decades later, the aging veterans of both the blue and the grey would occasionally gather, shaking hands across the old stone walls. They shared a profound, unspoken understanding of the sheer hell they had survived, bound together by the blood soaked into the earth. Today, the wind still blows quietly across the grassy fields of Antietam and Gettysburg, hiding the darkest chapter of American history. A unified nation built upon a monumental mountain of corpses, the American Civil War stands as a chilling reminder of the ultimate price of freedom.